What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the game designer on the Summoners Rift team. Here to talk about patch 13.17. Preview went up on Twitter earlier today, and I'm here to talk about some extra context around what we did and why. Worth noting, this is my second time recording because my mic randomly stopped working partway through. I didn't know when, and so we're starting over. I got 44 minutes in when I started talking about Gore Drinker, so you can time me to see if I get the Gore Drinker faster than that this time around. Anyway, let's talk about the content around what went down in this patch. So the quick rundown here is that patches have sort of two phases to them. That's actually an oversimplification, but whatever. Every 2 weeks in real life, this is going to be tomorrow for us, so it's Tuesday night. We are 6 days into patch 13.16, and we have basically locked patch 13.17. We start planning for 13.18 tomorrow, and then we start beginning work on that patch. That sort of process, we're going to plan what we want to have in the patch, and we're going to sort of try to build out larger scope changes. That usually takes about 3/4 of our time. The last quarter of our time is down here, what's called State of the Game, which is reactive balance, and we meet on Monday. We go over, hey, what are some champions that we can change with really low scope work that we can do to make the game better? And, assess champions, assess targets, then go from there. Most of these things were actually things that I picked up this patch. So it's actually a sort of me-heavy patch. Essentially, the other designers who are on the live pod are on even longer-term projects that won't ship until after Worlds. I had the discretionary time available to pick up some projects, and so I technically did a little bit of stuff on each of these 4 sections, and so we'll go through them in turn. And then basically I did nothing for State of the Game because my Monday and Tuesday was spent making sure all these things were tuned after doing the work earlier on last week. Okay, so first things first, an update to Lethality Fighters. So a couple things I want to bring up. Number 1, Eclipse is both an assassin and a fighter item. It is intentionally hybrid in between the two. So seeing fighters build Eclipse does not offend us. It means they're taking a fairly aggressive build path. That can be fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with an aggressive build path. The real concern is things like Duskblade Cyrilda's Aatrox, where this frontline champion has 0 bonus health or resists in his build for a while. This is the relatively common builds for Vi and Xin Zhao that are doing Eclipse Essence Reaver as 2nd and 3rd slot. Again, no durability, just pure lethality, pure burst, nothing else. And Hecarim, who is so bound to Mana Immunity that his builds are also very, very squishy, not to mention, of course, the aforementioned Duskblade that he's also building quite a bit of. And so the point here is to do some light reshapes, plus some item updates later on in the patch, to try to get these champions to feel supported by the fighter item ecosystem with relatively small kit updates in each case. So again, it's for these champions to feel supported in the fighter item ecosystem so that they can build hybrid damage durability items and feel like it's the right item for them, that it makes sense on their champion. Okay, so first up is Aatrox. There were other versions of this change list. The core difficulty with Aatrox changes right now is being a self-healer is a core part of his pattern, a core part of his identity. It could be that the numbers are still too high. They can go down and still be reasonable. That's entirely possible. But essentially, any self-healing fighter is a very, very scary balance threat because if you heal based off your offensive output, it means that buying damage is both a burst increase and a durability increase, which means you can hit a tipping point, especially as a class of fighter where maybe you're not burstable because you have soul lane XP, because your health and armor growth and MR growth are high, right? Melee champions have higher magic growth than ranged champions. They usually have higher health growth, they usually have higher armor growth, so they're very durable. And if they self-heal, it's like, well, if they kill one and heal back up to 3/4, they won't die for the rest of the team fight. And that's a very scary pattern to have in a team game where everyone's agency is supposed to matter. So there was a version of this change list where Aatrox gained % bonus health on our activation to say like, hey, if you buy a Black Cleaver, you get 50% more during ult, but it won't multiply your base health, only health you buy. I think there maybe is still legs on a change like that at some point, but what we're doing right now is fairly easy, fairly simple, and it's saying, look, lethality may scale a lot of your damage, but it will not scale your healing, really, or your damage nearly as hard. So by changing the passive and the W to magic damage, this means that lethality no longer scales the Deathbringer stance stab, and no longer increases the healing that does because all of his healing is post-mitigation. Now, I think it's actually important that his healing remain post-mitigation because that's how lifesteal works in our game, and having Aatrox break form kind of sucks. It also means that Aatrox even further checkmates tanks because, like, well, you bought a Bramble Vest, it's hilarious, that didn't cut my healing literally at all. he doesn't have to auto attack you, so he doesn't have to, take Grievous. It's like, no, you bought armor and it did absolutely nothing. Why'd you bother? Now I realize that buying armor does absolutely nothing to the passive and the W now, but at least it still affects his Q and everything else. But I mean, the nice thing is you buy Bramble Vest, it affects the passive because he stabs, right? So, congratulations. Regardless, though, the big thing is to say, hey, buying Duskblade and Cyrilda's early is going to do a lot less for you as a champion is the big thrust here, which means now the opportunity cost of Gore Drinker is no longer, well, if I buy Gore Drinker instead of, a Duskblade, I'm giving up self-healing, right? Gore Drinker is a worse healing item than Duskblade. That's a bit of a problem, right? I don't think we're willing to break with the trend of the healing being post-mitigation, which means, okay, well, we'll break your lethality synergy in other ways, which is these things dealing magic damage. I think artistically this can make sense. W is a projectile. It's functionally a spell. That's a pretty reasonable sell. The passive has its own animation. It's a different hit. It's like the empowered sword stab. Pretty reasonable here. I think this is an acceptable change. I think it's on theme. Theming is important, to be clear, but I think a relatively safe change. I want to point out that this is going to be, I think, a strict buff for like Gore Drinker, Black Cleaver, Sterix Gauge, Death Stance, whatever, Aatrox. Basically, every champion of the game has way more base armor, or at least, by level 12 or whatever, but way more armor than Magic Resist in the game, and most champions are going to build armor against this champion. So if you are doing a, bruisery build with no armor pen, well, you just have more damage and passive, more damage and W. Congratulations, we've just buffed your champion. If you're going to go for Duskblade Cyrilda's, it's a little bit more nebulous. Haven't done all the math in this one, so there is still a chance this is still a buff to Duskblade Cyrilda's, but it is certainly much less of one, so it's going to close that gap. So that's kind of the goal here. There's not much more to say. There is likely to be some follow-up balance work here, but I think this is a good change to get Aatrox to have much, much less opportunity cost in going for tankier builds. Next is Hecarim. The first big thing is a mana reshape. The point here is to make him less reliant on Manamune. So there's two things here. So one, his baseline mana pool is going down, 60 mana growth becoming 40 mana growth. As compensation, his mana regen is going up meaningfully, and his Q and W costs are going down. So the hope is that if you skip buying tier, you feel better than before. Like, skipping buying tier should be strictly power positive. You have more mana regen, you have less mana, but you have lower cost, and overall, doing the math, tierless Hecarim should just be stronger. A strict buff to tierless Hecarim. If you do buy Manamune, the fact you have less of a mana pool means scaling towards level 18, you'll eventually have 9 less attack damage and 12 less on hit spell damage, which, considering the 80 ratio factors in the Q, is actually 20 less damage on your Q. So that's a very big hit. So if you want to keep buying Manamune, you're going to do 20 less damage at level 18 per Q. And if you don't want to buy Manamune, you are stronger because you have fewer mana constraints, right? So it's saying, hey, you don't need to build this item on a cost concern or a damage concern. So you can go ahead and build something in the fighter system instead. You can go build something a little bit tankier, and it's going to be more reasonable. Don't worry about it. You can, go Shojin or something else. So again, strict buff to tierless Hecarim. Pretty much a strict nerf to with tier Hecarim, saying you don't have to build one of these items that has only damage and no durability on it. The other change is that attack damage scales itself thrice through the same mechanic. So Q has an 80 ratio. Q also has a % more damage amp per stack. That % damage amp has an 80 ratio. And then your W heals you for damage dealt to enemies inside its radius, which also has an 80 ratio. So AD multiplies AD multiplies AD is a really, really aggressive, probably shouldn't triple dip 80 ratio set on this champion. So while we're here, also there is, so basically it's the W no longer has an 80 ratio. This is very, very light touch. Keep in mind that that ratio is fake in the first place, because even at 200 bonus AD, that's 4% Omnivamp on a build with 25 Omnivamp. Like, that's very, very little. It's functionally not there. The other thing, though, is then actually nerfing the W from 25 flat to 20% flat Omnivamp. Now, keep in mind that he's going to heal for, like, let's say he deals 2,000 damage. He, like, straight up solo kills the enemy AD carry. If he deals 2,000 damage by himself to a target in his W over the course of those 4 seconds, well, instead of healing for, 29%, he's going to heal for 20%. Okay, he's going to heal for 9% less of 2,000 damage. Okay, that's 180 The W nerf is 180 less health per 100 to 0 solo kill if you 100 to 0 someone in 4 seconds. Meanwhile, instead of Manamune, you can buy any item with Ruby Crystal in it, and you get all that health back instantly. So I don't believe this is actually a huge nerf to Hecarim, because the healing he would have gotten could just be replaced by having an item with health on it. He just doesn't need the 80 as badly, and he's going to be fine. That's the hope. That's the goal here, right? The other thing is that this champion is also being buffed via the Shojin changes. Spear of Shojin is being, I think, massively buffed this patch. It's going to be easily best slot in Hecarim. It's actually already best slot in Hecarim, which is going to be his best item by far now. And that is, I think, a direct win rate buff to Hecarim. Him moving over to Shojin is going to be a buff to Hecarim. These changes overall, my actual expectation is Hecarim's resting win rate, assuming players actually move over, will raise between patch 13.16 to patch 13.17. I think he will gain win rate on patch 13.17, assuming players actually shift builds. Now, we saw from Zeri that on day 1, more than half of all Zeri players built Trinity Force first item, so we know players don't read. A lot of them do, right? The behavior shifted pretty quickly over time, but a thing, okay? Let's move forward, though. I think these are good changes to Hecarim. Next up is a reshape to Vi. Honestly, this will be a pretty large nerf. To be fair, Vi really kind of sucks right now. She's around 48, 49 in low elo, and 46 to 47, I think, in higher ones. So she could actually use a strict buff. Yes, I know she's kind of a stale pro pick. She was in meta for the entire year, but honestly, I would rather have Vi Wukong than Maokai Sejuani, so I'm okay if Vi is back to a top 4 jungler in this meta in 1317 at Worlds. I think that's actually honestly reasonable. I think she's more exciting. Anyway, though, let's talk about the changes. So I mentioned this earlier, I think. Vi has a pretty large portion of her builds are Essence Reaver and Collector. And usually if fighters feel the need to build lethality, and need to play exclusively for Ballistic Missile one-shot or B one-shot, it means that the kit doesn't support a fighter pattern well enough. And so the big change here was these two to say, I am trying to support your fighter pattern. So the passive ratio is currently 10%. It was 13% earlier. This is now going to 12. The next thing is the W refunds your passive cooldown whenever it does the 3-hit passive. That refund is being increased to say, look, if you want to play in the thick of it and you can keep auto-attacking, you're going to get more shields, and those shields are bigger. And this is going to, right, this is, multiplicative with itself. You're going to get more bigger shields. And the longer you live, the more you can auto-attack to get more bigger shields, right? This is going to snowball on itself a little bit, right? I think self-shielding is a much healthier outlet for durability than self-healing, where if you go win your 1v1 and heal to full, now it's a 4v5 and they just can't win against a fighter anymore. Whereas if it's well, they chunked you to half, then you went and killed Vayne, then came back, you're still at half, it's a much healthier output for the champion, and is much more sort of reasonable overall, but here's the change here. This is the primary thrust of it. The other stuff is kind of minor. This is meant to entice you to max W second. On current patch, it seems as though W max second is actually probably already correct. But if the rank up incentive of E gets lesser, so right now you go from a 14 second cooldown to 8. This is now going to be a 12 second cooldown to 8. So you're going to get half a second cooldown less per rank up because you've already gotten it by rank 1. So less likely to max E second, more likely to max W second, which is, again, right, the play pattern we actually want more. And then saying, look, this is a lot of power to this champion. We're probably going to be, at a really kind of extreme level. So we're going to bring a nerf back in, and it's just baseline R reliability. I suspect actually that R power level is a lot of why she is such a pro pick. Pro is a much slower paced game. And so long ultimates tend to be less meaningful there because there just aren't that many chaotic fights anyway. If it's well, if my ult's up every time there's a dragon, who cares what the cooldown is? If it's a lot longer than 5 minutes, I have ult every time it matters. This is why Summoner TP is much more performant in pro play than even Challenger solo queue. Because every solo queue is much more chaotic and fast-paced and action-packed. So that Summoner TP is down for 80% of all team fights, whereas in pro play, it's up for 80% of all team fights. And so I think an R cooldown nerf, or sorry, this is not a cooldown nerf, it's an R base power nerf where every time Vi fights in Pro, she SR. 300 time Vi fights in solo queue, she doesn't. And so this is a bit more of a pro-focused nerf. Brings her damage down a little bit, brings her reliable damage down. If we're saying, hey, the combat pattern we like for Vi is a longer combat pattern, relying on passive shields, relying on popping W more often. Okay, we're going to be less of a burst damage champion. The lockdown's still there. That's still reliable. If you're having a bad game, you want to go tank, and you want to just like R onto an AD carry, you can still do all the CC setups, all that kind of stuff. That's all still available for you, but less of a ballistic missile champion. Next is Xin Zhao. Pretty simple change here. This is just converting his passive from base plus a total AD ratio to a percent HP ratio. The TLDR on this is that the base value, accounting, this is the total AD by the way, so this would scale with character level as well. TLDR, this is always in the green if you are 0 item for the entire game. If you buy Frozen Heart into 7 chain vests, this is green every single level, basically. If your build is Eclipse into Collector into Essence Reaver, this is red after you get around, I think it's like 50 or something bonus attack damage without any bonus health. But if you buy so much as a Trinity Force, if you get like 300 bonus HP at all, it's green just forever. You basically can't outcompete that. Essentially, it goes from getting +1 heal per longsword to getting about +5 heal per ruby crystal. So it's a pretty substantial scaling buff in terms of the reward for the gold income. So he can just kind of more aggressively scale the self-healing. And compared to someone like Olaf or Aatrox or Red Kayn, getting 5% or 4% of your max health every 3 auto attacks is just not such an extreme amount of healing that's going to matter. Like, it only scales off attack speed and max HP. It doesn't scale off armor pen, doesn't scale off Cyrildas, doesn't scale off one shot of the enemy AD carry in the blink of an eye. So I think this is a very healthy sort of health restore outlet. So I think I'm pretty happy with this, and a pretty low risk change, but also it's going to be about 1% or so win rate to Xin Zhao, which I think is cool. He's pretty weak right now. Next we have changes is to fighter items. The whole point here is an undercurrent in the back of my head. There's basically 3 undercurrents that I'm trying to infuse every patch with to a certain degree, and I hit them to different degrees each patch, but these are the things that I'm giving my head and trying to do every time. Or at least get 2 out of 3 every time. So jungle is OP, and I think the biggest pain point in League right now is actually just that jungle is OP. And so it's trying to nerf jungle more than buff. If it's by champions or systemically, fine, but lower the power of jungle a little bit if I can over time. It's that top lane feels really bad, and that the game is burstier than it was 10 months ago. So the TLDR on the burstiness front is that obviously the durability update in 12.10 did a lot. It got whacked back a bit in 12.12 because assassins weren't able to function. And it got whacked back more in 12.14, which is a pro play focused patch, which heavily increased game snowballing. It nerfed a bunch of defensive runes, buffed offensive runes, buffed Drakes a whole bunch. And so the game is actually still quite snowbally. The game is certainly less lethal than it was in 12.9. So, right, current modern League of Legends with a pretty weak shield bow, with all the changes that have been made so far, Bloodthirst not having a shield, overheal, back to being unpopular, all that kind of stuff. It is still more durable than pre-durability update, but the gains of the durability update have, sort of been lost slowly over time. Not sequitur, but still about fighter items here, is how I think about items and sort of the sort of design, I don't want to call it direction, that's not really quite accurate. I guess the design direction for me going forward with this kind of stuff is, so for context, when the Mythic item update came out, the big sort of, my understanding of it, I was an outsider, I was a shoutcaster, but I looked at the emails and I talked to some designers once in a while. The overarching idea was player choice, right? We're going to give you a bunch of options. These are meant to be fairly broadly appealing, and you're going to choose which mythic you want based on what you see game state wise. You're going to make interesting choices based on what you see. I think that was a little bit flawed, unfortunately, and I think we've discovered it over time, because I was on that train too. I'm like, yeah, heck yeah, some cool offensive items given player choice, go for it. I think item choice works in a reactive context. This is reactive in terms of I want steel caps or merc treads or lucidity boots, or I want merc treads or sword shoes. This is, do I need to buy an early stopwatch? This is, do I want to go grab an arm guard? Do I want to grab a hex drinker? Do I want to get mod? Do I want to get QSS? Do I want to get Wit's End? Because you don't buy it every game, but you buy it when it matters, right? Do I want to buy Less Whisper? Do I want to buy Void Staff? Right, those are reactive, right? Do I want to buy Grievous Wounds, right? Reactive purchases to what the enemy has, what they're doing in this game, I think that works because the choice is really obvious. They have healing. Well, buy the one anti-healing item that works for your class. And you're making the choice to buy exactly one item, but the cost is that it slows down your normal build. Okay, but like Hecarim can choose to go for Kempuk Chainsword instead of Black Cleaver or something else because there's 2 healers in the enemy team. That's choice. And you can choose not to and say, I can burst him. Okay, if you think so, great, go for it. Wow, the team has a lot of knockdown. I'm going to go Merc Treads. Okay, the team is really AD heavy. Okay, I'm going to get, Steel Caps. I'm going to go Death Dance early on. Do this, whatever. Their team is really deadly. Okay, I'm going to buy some health items, right? Like, that works, right? The reactive purchases make sense. I think offensive items do not fit this bill, except in the exact case of like Last Whisper type items. I think offensive items, I think it's almost impossible to get player choice. Because essentially, you'll just theory craft beforehand, and it's very, very hard to have sort of kit-bound offensive items have any further context. Like, at the end of the day, Ravenous Hydra is just Riven's best item. It just is. She's always going to buy it. Maybe she can't buy it first because she needs enough health to, like, not get one shot by Darius in lane. Fine. She's buying it second. Pretty much always, right? That's just how it's going to work. Guess what? On hit champions, they're gonna buy Rage Blade. That's just going to be true. Sivir, she's gonna go Quick Blades. Xayah, she's gonna go Quick Blades. That's just gonna happen. That's fine. I don't think it's actually a problem. And so it's sort of acknowledging that, look, offensive stuff is actually just kit bound. With that in mind, let's go make these items make sense for the kits. So before, back in the day, and like I have receipts, right? I did patch rundowns for every patch for the last, many, many years. Like, I was initially on team itemization choice. I didn't think about it enough to realize that, like, this was never going to happen. You're just not going to get there because turns out Riven never wants to buy attack speed. So she's just, half these items just don't exist for her. She's never going to buy that. She has attack resets. This is a wasted stat. There's no text on that item. Flat move speed doesn't matter. She hops everywhere. Why would she bother? Never going to buy the stuff. So, okay, makes sense, right? So let's have these items make sense for the suites of champions. And these things still aren't perfect. Like, hey, turns out if you can't use Sheen very well, what item do you want? Well, maybe it's tough for you, right? So it's not going to be perfect, but I think it's an improvement overall for the game if it's like, look, the Iron Spike Whip items are the high health fighter items. The combat pattern of Iron Spike Whip is get surrounded by as many enemy champions as possible and hit them all with the active. Oh, Gore Drinker? Yeah, the heal ramps per target hit. Stride Breaker? More damage, more slow because I get each one with it. Like, the active says I scale with number of nearby enemy champions. So guess what? Iron Spike Whip items should probably just be the tankiest fighter items. Like, they should probably be, like, on the tier of, like, Sterix Gauge and Death Stance, where it's, like, a lot of the power budget is in not dying. There was actually an initial version of some of those pitches that was, actually minus damage plus health, and let's get into it. So, Gore Drinker, Stride Breaker, the Iron Spike Whip items, right? Saying, hey, these items are going to go plus durability, right? We're going to go... And there was a version, as I said, that was, it was minus 5 AD plus 150 health in these. Ultimately said, okay, let's just make it a strict buff. I think long-term, if people identify these items overpowered, and they might be, minus 5 AD can happen on these items, and just be like, yep. But I think placing them as high-health fighter items, saying, look, your fighter mythic... that, cares about you being on top of the enemy champion and, hitting multiple targets. Yeah, these are the healthy ones, right? The choice comparison between this and Triforce, forget it. Doesn't matter. Do you have Sheen or not? Who cares? That's your real choice? No, these are tankier items. And so strict buffs to Gore Drinker and Stride Breaker to say that's what these builds are about. Gore Drinker, this is a Caulfield's Warhammer, becomes a Phage instead to sort of make room for the bonus health. I think it makes total sense. It's a thematically appropriate item component. Move on from that one. Next is a rework, but a very, very large buff to Spear of Shojin. This is basically saying, look, this is the actual shape I want to take this item, which is it having... So here's the thing with... I think Shojin has multiple problems. I think only 2 of which I'm kind of fixing here. Okay, so one is that we're not fixing is I think Shojin has too much going on. Did you know that Spear of Shojin gives you move speed? And if so, what's the mechanic? I'm sure many of you do, but like, oh, it's Spear of Shojin, the really, really high AD item with the bonus haste that scales off AD that also has move speed on it. It has, in my opinion, slightly too much going on, which makes you forget all of what the item does for you. It has the most move speed of any fighter in the game by a lot, and it's like super not close. Um, so that's part of it. Is I think the item has so much going on, it is hard to appreciate what the item actually does. Like if the exigency passive just said you have 5% increased move speed, people would be like, oh, this is the AD move speed item. I got it. And then like people would buy it more often. The second thing, and this is actually kind of a combined point, is Shojin had been tuned to be a fighter capstone item, right? It was like, yes, this item is going to be tuned to be good third. It's why the Dragon Force bonus ability haste is going to scale off bonus AD. The ratio is actually really aggressive. It didn't take very much AD to double the value like based on his item. And so it's like, yes, this is a third item fighter capstone. Also, this item only has 300 health. So you have to be a fighter who really wants AD and ability haste. That's a lot of them. That's not too hard. Has to wait to buy it third. And since you're buying it third, you are fully into team fights. And you're going to spend 3,300 gold on 2 ruby crystals. And you're going to actually survive team fights on this. And that's where I thought the item got far too narrow. And so I'm like, look, we're gonna strictly buff this item. Well, I say strictly. We're going to buff this item. Fine. I think it can be buffed in the short term. It's totally okay. We can always walk it back later when people have discovered this item is good. That's totally fine. Super amenable to that, right? But it's like, okay, let's reshape a bit. Minus 5 AD, plus 150 health. Okay, so now I think it's 450 health and only 60 AD instead of 65 AD. But it's like, oh, okay, this now has about as much health as a Sterix gauge. Now, Sterix has the shield. Sterix is clearly the more durable option. It's, of course. But this is now strongly a mid-sized item, where it's got more than a Giant's Belt in it. You've got a solid, 1,000 or so health worth of durability on top, like, or 1,000 or so gold worth of durability. It's like, okay, cool. A solid, like, 1/3 of this item's gold cost is in durability. Okay, this opens it up a lot more, where this is now something you are willing to say, well, I'm going to sacrifice some durability, but not all of it. The bigger change, I think, is opening it up as a second item. TLDR, this is doubling the like base value contributor from Dragon Force, and then 1/2 the bonus AD ratio contributor to Dragon Force, the bonus ability haste, which means that you have 200 bonus AD, which is 4 items. This item is buffed. So it's buffed first, it's buffed second, it's buffed third, it's nerfed fourth. So if it's nerfed fourth, you're probably not buying it third because it's like, ooh, it's slightly better than immediately slightly worse. Not exciting. Because it's like, I bought it and then I bought a pickaxe and now it's worse. It's like, well, it's not really a better third item in this result, but it is a much better second item. This item is sick. This item's gold efficiency is up, especially second slot. And build path made a little bit cleaner. Instead of a BF sword, there is a pickaxe building into it. So it's pickaxe, Caulfield's Warhammer, and then Kindle Gem. It means his item gets like, I think it's, 350 becomes 500 health, I think is the actual number, but like, it means his item gets like 300 health from just the combine. It's not the prettiest, but like, it's fine. Fighters generally want to build their long swords anyway. Long term, yeah, there's probably a world where it's actually like Warhammer plus Winged Moonplate plus Kindle Gem, and we do something a little bit different, but like, it's fine, honestly. It's reasonable for now. Whatever. Okay, so yeah, big of Shojin, but I think there's going to be a lot more users who are going to buy this item second, and it's going to feel a lot better. Okay, the next thing is jungle stuff. So you may have seen on Thursday, I think on PBE, there were a bunch of jungle changes that came in that have been reverted since then. So I put those changes into the release build, and basically I was under the mistaken impression that we wanted to ship sweeping jungle changes this patch, and so I whipped up a change list, sourced it around for feedback. It was like, okay, I'm going to identify runes that are used by junglers more than other champions. I'm going to find some systemic jungle levers to go pull on, and I'm going to systemically nerf jungle. And then it was like, okay, we're not in that much of a rush. We can wait a little bit. It's like, oh, okay, let me pull both of this out, except the stuff that I really believe in. And so what I believe in, what I kept from the stuff that I worked on was nerfing some champions, and nerfing futures market. So let's go into first of the Kayn nerf. So we'll go with the win rate target here. Basically, so the target selection, by the way, was like, hey, who are some really high agency, like snowbally 1v9 take over the game junglers that are clearly dominating solo queue? Kayn is chief among them. If you use like public data, like tier list stuff, like if you go to like lawlytics or u.gg or whatever, it's like who's the S tier champion, who's the A tier champion, who's S plus. If you look at China data, like if you look at what's going on on the Tencent servers, Kayn is like the clear S plus champion there. It's like extreme. He's like first place by a lot. It's really interesting. And like all this stuff's kind of fake. Like win rate is sort of more what you care about in terms of like measuring power objectively. But in terms of like, oh, this champion is individually dominant, there's something kind of decent about like the public sort of tier list creation stuff, which is kind of cute. It does a decent job of like explaining. I mean, since like so many content creators make tier lists, and then like you have websites who use stats to make tier lists, it's like, well, actually a lot of our players just kind of view the game in a tier listy way. And so it's like, here's Kai'Sa. Her win rate's pretty good, and her pick rate's really, really high. S plus. And it's like, Misfortune has a higher win rate and lower ban rate and isn't. Okay, whatever. And I mean, people feel what they feel. I'm not saying that people's emotions are wrong. This is kind of interesting. I don't have much to say about this. Just like it's an observation, I guess, more than anything. Anyway, TLDR, Kayn is not only individually dominant, but also wins a lot of games. We have quite a bit of win rate budget available to us. And what I wanted to do was nerf blue Kayn a bit more than red Kayn. And try to do it in a way that I thought would create healthier gameplay overall. I want to, like, the goal is always to make League of Legends a more fun game. And so it means, champions should be a little bit less dominant when they're dominant, especially if they're solo carries. I think there's potentially a good balance strategy, which is that teammate focused champions. This is like Malphite, Ivern, Ashe, Enchanter supports, mid laners like Orianna, maybe even Karma. It's like, oh, actually, these champions should have privileged win rates. And the solo carries like Master Yi and Darius and Kayn and Zeri and brand support, and like those champions should actually have the privileged win rates, and they're going to sit at 49. I was going to sit at 51. I don't know if that's actually a strategy that we should do. I haven't given it a ton of thought. I haven't brought it up to other people, but like maybe that's like the right shape for League of Legends to incentivize being a team player. I don't know. It's just a random thought. Anyway, either way, point is Kayn can use a nerf. And targeting a bit more to blue Kayn than red Kayn. So I think W damage is more of a blue Kayn ability than red Kayn ability. Keep in mind that blue Kayn casts this thing when he's hiding over a wall while moving. I mean, I think the number of W's landed like per game is clearly higher for blue than red. Also in terms of power budget, red Kayn's Q is more damage than blue Kayn's Q. So just the AD ratio is also higher, by the way. So it's like, okay, well, red Kayn is clearly using his Q more. It's just like, okay, by nerfing W, nerfing blue Kayn by more. Also, I think this ability has the least gameplay. And so the very first nerf was a 30% AD ratio off of W. Ultimately, thought about it, was like, that's probably too harsh. That's too much of a nerf. I'm going to walk it back to 20% AD ratio on W. Then met with part of the team this evening and went over sort of win rate targets and win rate magnitudes. Hey, did we think 20% AD ratio on W was going to be enough? The read was that it was going to be a little bit under in case of both blue Kayn and red Kayn. And it was like especially blue Kayn skewed on AD ratio, and so added a 5 flat damage nerf as well, which should be a little bit flatter. Red Kayn's going to use the base damage a bit more compared to the AD ratio compared to blue. Red Kayn's builds a little bit less plus AD than blue Kayn's builds. So, bridging that gap a little bit in terms of what we're targeting, but essentially, it tended to be a meaningful Kayn nerf. Next is a Kha'Zix nerf. So this ends up being actually pretty small. It's funny looking at this, and it's like, wow, you nerfed the base damage and the AD ratio a ton on Kayn. It's like, well, yes, this ability has a relatively long cooldown and is missable. Kha'Zix Q is not missable. Also, this AD ratio more than doubles when they're isolated. So it's actually a 10% nerf in a lot of contexts. Also, the cooldown is less than half. So it's the same ratio nerf now, right? If it's twice this number and half the cooldown, it's now 20 again. In the same time frame as like a Kayn W. Anyway, so this point is a reminder to me that Kha'Zix had exactly this kind of nerf in 11.22. There was a 15% AD ratio nerf on his Q, and that ended up being somewhat elo skewed, but essentially about 2.5% win rate. we have like historic patch by patch win rates dating back several years, and so I was like, hey, what are some patch histories for Kha'Zix? Okay, he actually had this exact nerf before. Find the patch. Okay, cool. Which means if I'm targeting about 1% win rate off of Kha'Zix as like the amount of room I have for nerfs, then I'll do about a third of a 2.5% win rate nerf, and I'm going to get about 0.8, which is fine. Now it's actually worth noting that there's a couple of different changes here. The contexts have changed. So one is the durability update happened after 1.22. So everyone has more armor and more health than before. So, maybe the Q means a bit less in that result because he needs to use more of the kit to finish a kill, more of his passive, who knows. The other side of it is that Q is more likely to get the isolation bonus because earlier on this year, the isolation radius got shrunk, so he's more likely to be isolated. So actually, this is more likely to be the amplified version of Q, which means maybe it's higher than this. Either way, we're in the ballpark about 1% win rate. That's about how much guardrail we have. And again, it's taking, hey, who are some really popular, individually overbearing junglers that we can nerf? We have this much, power budget we can siphon off. And I'm trying to siphon it off in ways of like, oh, okay, well, you really, really scale off of snowballing and getting your first rated Dirk really quickly. Let's lower this rated Dirk power spike. Let's lower the you're winning by a lot, you keep taking over the game power spike. Or, continued carry potential. The final individual jungle nerf is to Kindred here. This is, of course, percent, but, 8 plus 0.5 per mark. 5% plus 0.5 per mark is the new change. Slowed down by 20% here as well. Kindred, it's really unfortunate. We've nerfed Kindred a couple times so far this year. Unfortunately, the magnitudes just haven't been enough. It's interesting. We buffed Kindred really early on in mid-season. People just had not discovered how good they were with Trinity Force. And so it probably didn't buff the champion, unfortunately. But end of the day, okay, well, Kindred is overperforming, especially in elite MMRs. Okay, fine. And we just kept trying to find changes that would show as elite skewed. Base armor, base health didn't seem elite skewed. Changing Q damage and unempowered Q cooldown didn't seem to be elite skewed, so entirely new tactic. Let's try to go after the E. Essentially, lower the early gank power and an ability that has somewhat of a either your teammates help you lock down or your timing is better and you make sure you get the bonus damage and you get the amp diversion or whatever. But essentially, hey, what if we lower the base and execute? We kind of lower the sort of baseline, especially kind of early game damage of this champion, and make Kindred rely a little bit more on maybe gold income or just overall performance instead. But, really, it's like lowering the early gank power, I think, is pretty valuable. I think early gank power is a great lever to take away from people. What's nice, even with like the Kayn and the Kha'Zix changes, even on just a stat shard, they're getting a little bit off, but, it's the first recap of a longsword or whatever going to affect them there as well. So, yeah, early gank nerf for Kindred. Not much to say here. Hoping that it's going to be elite skewed because that is really the only MMR where Kindred is really overperforming. But I think a very worthy nerf all the same. So then a couple more sort of systemic... Or we'll try to shorten this so it's easy to read. There we go. Yeah, so there were a bunch of runes that I wanted to nerf, or at least had planned on nerfing, because they're disproportionately used by junglers. We held back on that because, there's good reasons to hold back. I don't need to go into it. It's not a big deal. We still, of course, plan on nerfing jungle probably systemically in the near-ish future, but Futures Market is actually just overpowered. This item, or this rune, is too strong. Essentially, you get less early lending limit, but your lending limit goes up per minute more. TLDR breaks even after turret plates fall, so it's an early game nerf. The ability to finish an Iron Spike Whip first recall for a jungler. Of course, it matters for mid lane as well, don't get me wrong. But considering you're going to get fewer strong purchases, the opportunity cost, like the opportunity cost is always there, right? There's a different rune you could take instead. But in terms of what this rune provides in the first place, it's going to provide a little bit less. And so, maybe you don't have that break point, and it's going to, of course, be less power on average. That's fine. This rune is OP. Much to say, the rune's OP. It's used disproportionately by junglers, so it is a slight disproportionate jungle nerf. Great. So next change, this is not mine, but a really good catch. So Ketchup XP actually had rounded up always. And so what this means was, if you were a jungler and you were down 2 levels on the average level of the game, you would get bonus XP from your jungle camps. I believe is the rules text there. But the number rounded up, which means if you were down 1.1 levels, you would get bonus XP. Now it requires you to be down 1.5 levels. Now that looks kind of small on paper, but let's take an example. Let's say everyone in the game is level 2, And actually, sorry. Let's say everyone in the game is level 3. I'm level 2. And the mid laner is level 4. Technically, the average level is 3. I don't know if it counts you or not. I actually don't know. So either it counts me or it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the experiment very much. The mid laner dings 4 briefly. Catch-up XP. Or we'll say both mid laners ding 4. Catch-up XP. Because mid laners, right? I guess the waves do meet at the same time as top laners, but mid laners wave clear faster. So they wave clear the level 4 wave, and bam! I'm level 2, mid laners are 4. Bonus XP. Here we go. Just mid laners. But now it's like, no. Both mid laners are 4. Both top laners are 4. And your jungler. Right? If 5 champions are up the level, cool. And actually, and again, I don't know if it counts me or not. I'm not actually 100% certain. But anyway, basically it just means like 4 more champions need to be a second level up on you before this kicks in, which is a much harder breakpoint to reach. And then again, it's going to change here. Sorry, I really didn't actually explain what goes on. So the level difference rounds, but it used to exclusively round up. So 1.1 equaled 2. Now 1.5 equals 2. So if most people are 2 levels up on you, you get catch-up XP instead of if just a couple are 2 levels up on you, right? Is the change there. And then it kicks in again if you're 3 levels down, right? Instead of 1 champion, it requires 5 champions, etc., etc., etc. So this means, on average, junglers across a week's worth of games are going to have less XP than before. So the power level of jungle is going down. Especially if you've been put into the dirt. But if you've been put into the dirt really hard, right? Like, if you were already down 1.6 or 1.7 or 1.8 levels, you still have that catch-up XP. But it's this 1.1 to 1.4 where you're not going to have that difference there. And so that will, right, that is inevitably going to happen some, and it is going to print free XP some. And it'll do that less, so it's a meaningful, not huge, but meaningful sort of global decrease in jungle XP. It also makes counter jungling slightly stronger because you're less likely to kick them into the catch-up XP sort of bracket, all that stuff. But I think it's a really good change. Another thing in the jungle is Dragon Patience Bar now exists. This is really cool. So we actually had something like this earlier on. So my understanding, and this might be flawed, but I believe a lot of our jungle stuff was scripted in really sort of old ways, and some things like Dragon are actually just like so ancient. It's just built in a really, really, really ancient way. The AI it's hooked up to is really, really old and actually really hard to mess with. And so earlier this year, we had a thing called jungle AI nativization. And what that means is we took the AI we wanted for jungle camps and said, instead of like using sort of like scripting, and designers going to like, write out using a scripting language how they want the things to interact, and it's going to like ask, where am I, where are you, where's my jungle camp normally start at, every quarter second, what should we do? Now it's just written into the code of the game, I assume in C++ or something, which makes it more performant. It also makes it more reactive. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, the jungle patience bars react much more granularly. And essentially, it's like putting all the jungle camp AI into actual code, and just sort of cleaning up the rules. I think I wasn't really part of that process. I think it had already started by the time I joined SRT. I wasn't really part of the project, but it was jungle AI nativization. I've also heard the jungle bot brain, right? What's the brain powering the jungle robots, right? The little camps. So Dragon, also very, very old. This patch, we're bringing this tech to the Dragon as well. So there is some stuff we can tune as designers, leash radius, whatnot. But essentially, what's interesting is, so version 1, we ported our jungle, right? And jungle camps like work normally, right? Like everyone's pretty chill with how jungle camps work. So we ported that AI over to Dragon. It's like, this doesn't feel like anything like Dragon. Like live Dragon works nothing like live jungle camps. Like it was like very obvious from like oh, I'm playing this, like this isn't Dragon. This doesn't work anything like Dragon that I'm used to. And so unfortunately, it actually required a little bit of extra work of like, okay, well, we actually need to kind of give Dragon its own AI, which made it a annoying project. It made it take more code work and more design work and whatnot. But basically, hey, its brain is entirely different now. So there are going to be like some edge cases where it's going to work a little bit differently. But the big thing is now that it has real in-code AI, we can give it a patience bar over its head. And now you can like actually tell what the dragon's doing. So it's now much less likely that dragon out of nowhere is breathing fire and goes, no, 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 I ran out of patience, lands on the ground, hops back up, keeps fighting, heals for 1,000 health. That's basically gone. So great, right? Good changes here because man. So yeah, I think this is really cool. Again, there are going to be some AI differences. It's very close to live. Some of the leash radius, like some of the leash locations, is going to be very slightly different. It's going to be slightly different, but like the biggest change is you can now see its patience bar, and that's going to change how this fight goes. Yeah, just I think it's a really good change. I'm glad it's here, but a good update all the same. Okay, next big set of changes is a durability pass. So this is actually specifically comparing before and after the midseason update. So I'll just kind of go into it. So the first thing first was an investigation. Again, this is another project that I picked up in the week, and this was investigating 13.7 through 13.9 compared to 13.10 through 13.13. And just saying, okay, let's kind of compare, a couple of months right before midseason, right after midseason, and show me marksman. Since Bloodthirster, shields got removed, and Shield Bow got nerfed and turned into a legendary, this had pretty big effect on some champions. And so we already had the really obvious case where it's like, oh wow, Yasuo and Yone just got strictly nerfed. Like these champions need lifesteal, they really wanted the shield, these champions got weaker, and so like they got a bunch of durability, right? So those champs got updated because it was really obvious what happened to them, right? They lost a bunch of win rate, they lost a bunch of power, they just needed to be durable because they're melee champions in League of Legends. They have to have enough durability to survive, right? To function. What was under the surface was a bunch of marksmen who, some of them relied on shield bow, some of them didn't, but whose builds kind of shifted when the ecosystem shifted. And sort of we identified like, oh, there's a suite of champions who are actually a lot less durable than they were in midseason. So some weird cases, like Zeri, for example, didn't shift in midseason. She shifted in 13.12 because that's when she stopped going Trinity Force Satanic Hydra. And so that was the drop off. But it's like, okay, well, so Zeri actually dropped off by like, I think it was like 15%. So the graph, so what we're measuring here is the time to kill. How long are you in champion combat per death? And Zeri went down 15%. But that 15% is going from building Titanic Hydra Trinity Force into regular crit marksman stuff. And you look at the numbers and it's like, well, yeah, she used to die as slow as Graves and Kindred. Now she dies as slow as like normal marksman. Okay, the new number is actually totally reasonable. So Zeri definitely was like a victim of getting anti-durability updated, but also the old version was unacceptable. The new version is reasonable. We're actually happy with these numbers. At least it's sort of my call. I was like, here are my findings and recommendations. Zeri got nerfed by 50%. The numbers are fine. I think we shouldn't act. Vayne was a big shield bow user. She got nerfed by a bit. I suggest we didn't act. Because she's agile, chain stealthy. The entire conceit of this champion is that she's supposed to be dodging damage, not just immuning it. So I thought it was very reasonable to be like, we shouldn't act on Vayne either. Also, right now, her core build is actually involves Trinity Force, and so she actually has pretty good baseline durability. Again, she's top half for a marksman. A lot of it because, again, she builds a Ruby Crystal in her core build path. Anyway. But there were some champions identified, and so we went after those. So first is Akshan. So Akshan got updated in the mid-season update. So it was giving him an AP ratio in a couple of spots because we thought he might be a Rageblade user, and having no AP to scale the Rageblade was going to feel bad. And while we were there, we identified, this guy's kind of overpowered. And so I went for a high elo skill nerf on him, which was basically nerfing his passive shield. And so a combination of his build shifting away from Blade of the Ruin King and away from Wit's End, and also getting a nerf to his passive shield, meant that Akshan was like top 5 in time to kill shortened between 13.9 and the live game. And it's like, okay, well, let's go just give you systemic, just give you some power. Akshan's still pretty high elo skewed. Like, let's just give you health growth, let's give you armor growth. And in all these cases, I tried to make changes that very, very lightly pushed him back toward the old build, so he might be a bit more willing to go Wit's End, Blade of the Ruin King, and go slightly more towards the Skirmisher. Because the thing is, I think for a really aggressive crit marksman, where your team's going to peel for you. You're expecting to play in a normal team fight. I think it's important that those champions, on average, tend to be quite squishy. I think that's important for the shape of that champion because they've often got a dedicated support, someone with a Locket or a Braum or a Lulu or something like that. They know they're going to sit in mid and wait and play reactive in team fights. But someone like Akshan has to make his own plays. He's like specifically kind of an assassin. He's actually meant to go and take 1v1 fights or 2v1 fights, but like he's going for the flank. He actually should be baseline durable, and I think he should be above other marksmen, even though he's not like specifically a bruiser or really a skirmisher. Just the context of being in a solo lane, not having a pet Karma with him at all times means he probably needs a level of baseline durability, but be careful because if you have too much durability at level 1, now Darius Renekton cannot win all-ins against you anymore, so now they are checkmated in lane, right? Like, early durability means that melees can't all-in to create tension in a ranged melee matchup, but late durability, I think, is reasonable to give solo lane marksmen who just need enough baseline resilience to work, right? So that's why this change is happening in the first place. The goal is power neutral. I'm sure he'll go plus minus like 0.25%, but like that's not a huge deal. But again, the nerf target was to say, hey, we're going power neutral, so as you're getting more durability, you're going to take away some damage, right? Plus durability, minus damage is the only thing we do. We could go minus utility, but whatever. Minus damage is fine. So it's very light durability update. And essentially this is saying, well, you used to build kind of skirmisher, right? You used to go Wits, you used to go Blade of the Ruin King. He still goes Ruin King a lot, by the way. Wits a little bit less so. And it's like, well, okay, if you have less like total attack damage, you don't scale off of crit as hard anymore. And so the opportunity cost of Wit's End compared to, say, a Gale Force or something is actually a little bit lower. Not by a large amount, don't get me wrong, but a little bit lower of like, oh, I'm picking tactics, and you're going to be a little bit less likely to play crit marksman and a little bit more likely to play skirmisher because Wit's End doesn't care what your base AD is, basically at all. The attack speed scaler kind of cares, but for the most part, no. So again, power neutral, that's the thought process, right? Next up is Quinn. So Quinn, once again, plus health growth, right? The goal is to give, in both the Quinn case and the Akshan case, scaling to about 7% more baseline durability. The intent being that you'll live about 3% longer. That, you know, some fights you're just one shot 1-0. Some fights a longer tail, and it's like, well, I'm just gonna with broad strokes just say, well, if you're 7% more durable, you're gonna die 3% slower. I think it's like, yeah, it's close enough. I'm trying to go in this direction, but again, trying to go for power neutral. So, health growth increased pretty substantially. This is about 1% win rate worth of health growth, and so I'm going for about 1% win rate lost on damage rank ups. Worth noting that Quinn maxes W first, and then maxing Q second and E second have relatively similar win rates, although Q second is much more common. And basically saying, okay, look, what we've got here is minus 0 to 20 damage on Q, minus 0 to 20 damage on E. And this says, hey, Quinn, lethality is less good of a stat. You can go collector if you really just want to go and roam and go one shot a squishy. You can totally do that. That's totally fine. But if you want to go back towards regular crit builds, you want to build a shield bow, maybe you're going to go for, more attack speed scaling. You're going to use something like Wit's End, again, Blade of the Ruin King, slightly more on a skirmisher scale. Cool, flat damage on Q and flat damage on E. That cares what your lethality score is. They don't care if you have Wit's End. They don't care if you have crit chance. They don't care about, the long duration team fight, less burst. So essentially, Quinn is going to deal less burst. She's going to be less burstable. And again, the goal is roughly power neutral. In both Quinn's cases and Akshan's case, they could stand to lose a little bit of win rate. But again, it's probably plus or minus 0.25%. It is what it is. I'm not too worried about it. It's just, a nudge in the correct direction, which I think is totally reasonable. And again, as a solo laner, I think Quinn is allowed to be one of the more resilient marksmen in the game. In the way that like Graves and Kindred clearly are as well, right? So then there is Samira. It's worth noting that Samira, people are trolling her build somewhat. She really should be building Collector IE, and people are doing Duskblade a lot, but Collector IE is definitely her best build. People are moving over to it slowly over time. They will keep moving over to it, but... and the thing is, though, I am... And I know I did this with Hecarim, so I'm being a hypocrite here a little bit, which is I am sometimes loath to say, yeah, but your real Ren rate is this build you're not doing yet. In the Hecarim case, we're literally buffing the item that he should be building, and so I'm really confident people will switch the build. In Samira's case, we did the Duskblade nerf a while ago, and then another one, and she's still doing this, and it's like, this is going to be a bit of a slower adoption. So in this case, even though Samir is kind of trolling her builds, ultimately, I think it's reasonable to say, you know what? You can get a small buff here. So this is 30 base health. It's not huge, but this helps her in early 1v1s and early lane bully scenarios where, or 2v2s I should say, but like, the level 1, level 2, level 3 all-ins, maybe be a bit better at those. Usually 30 health is 1% win rate. And so we'll get a very clear example here. Now, it's worth noting that, like, because Duskblade's getting changed and because Shield Bow's getting changed, there's actually some other sort of turbulence with this patch, so it doesn't make it the cleanest measurement, but 30 health on Samir should be pretty reasonable. Then the next set of changes is to a set of items. So Shield Bow is getting buffed. The early shield goes from 215 to 290. So a pretty large buff, 75 on the early shield. Essentially, I think, right, because I'm the one who did the design work and shipped the mid-season AD carry item update, or the crit item update. And I essentially double nerfed Shield Bow and only need to do one thing. So, wasn't happy that AD carries were buying double shields. And thought, okay, well, we can place Shield Bow into a spot where it's a reasonable second or third purchase. But I nerfed it in a couple of ways. So one is I nerfed it by just lowering the shield value. Like, it's just weaker than Mythic Item Shield Bow. To be fair, it's not a Mythic Item, so it's kind of reasonable. But the other is by placing it as a second or third item, it's fighting up against really important item slots. Like, if you wanted to go Collector Shield Bow, you're not going Collector IE. That's a really big cost compared to, like, you could have gone, Shield Bow Collector IE in the old version, or just Shield Bow IE in, 13.3 through 13.9. And it's like, well, I'm giving up a Kraken Slayer or a Gale Force, which, like, yeah, kind of matters, but it's like, I kind of just auto buy this, right? And I think it's actually reasonable and probably correct that, like, you're not buying a fat shield and lifesteal on first slot. This is a good change overall. But it's like, just Shield Bow having a strong opportunity cost as second slot is probably enough to be reasonable here. And so it's going to be a strong second slot item, but you're still fighting up against your Mythic, and so it's not going to be every game. Bloodthirster, overall, slightly overperforms and is overpurchased compared to Shield Bow. This is basically meant to be a nudge to say, look, if you're going to buy a lifesteal item, BT is a bit worse, Shield Bow is a bit better. Really, really, really consider going Shield Bow, right? Consider this as a slightly stronger option. And ideally, I would like these items to be purchased a pretty similar amount. I mean, honestly, you're ahead about as often as you're behind, right? So you should ostensibly be buying Shield Bow about as often as you're buying Bloodthirster. And yes, Shield Bow is going to have less damage than BT, of course, but it's also cheaper. And you have a shield. And so to me, this feels like a pretty reasonable trade. I think Shield Bow is buffed by more than BT is nerfed, but overall, I think pretty reasonable change. I actually do also really like that BT is going to be on the same threshold as Absolute Focus. I'm also aware that it is going to probably hurt melee champions more than ranged ones. It's much harder for Yasuo and Yone to stay at, above 70% health compared to 50% health compared to, a ranged champion. But also, this item seems to very clearly overperform on them, and so I think it's fine to disproportionately nerf on them. And again, they can just go Shield Bow and it's fine. I think it's actually totally reasonable if Yasuo's core build is very slightly less assassiny and a very little bit more durable, as long as he's not getting lifesteal and burst resist on his very first slot, which he's probably not because he wants to buy 0 attack speed first slot, right? So I think this is shaped pretty well. The final thing is Even Shroud. There's definitely, I've seen some pretty severe pessimism on the internet around this item. This item is just, I think, overpowered. If you compare, like, if you look at like all ranks of players, Even Shroud has a higher pick rate and a higher resting win rate than Locket on tank supports. If you look at high elo, that win rate gap shrinks a little bit because more skilled players are better at using actives, no duh, but there's still a very meaningful gap, a very measurable gap. And Even Shroud's pick rate is like 2x that of Locket in Elite MMR. So Even Shroud is like the tank mythic. Even though Locket works on literally everyone. And so it's like, okay, well, this item is, essentially overpurchased. It's overpowered. And I'm targeting, essentially my win rate budget here is 1.5% win rate, which I think is roughly what we'll get with a 3% nerf here. A decent rule of thumb is 10% of an item's power level is about 1% win rate. And if Even Shroud is providing a bunch of stats and then also Mythic Passive, it's like, well, how much Mythic Passive is here? How much the item is Mythic Passive when it's about 100% gold efficient on its own. Also, there was a change to Even Shroud a while back that was a 1% damage amp increase, and I believe it also had a duration increase when it happened, and that ended up being about 0.5% win rate, so reading about triple that nerf, and it should be about 1.5% win rate on first item slot, even Shroud. Also, the fact that this item is clearly OP with the fact that like we're seeing Yone and Poppy and stuff poach it, like this item is clearly overtuned. And what's great is, hey, guess what? This is a very minor durability update 2.0 by saying, well, actually, instead of you facing off against 10% damage amps, you're going to face off against a Locket Shield. Fights are going to resolve more slowly. Right? And so, it's good. And I'm not saying like this is as much work and as huge for the game as 12.10, but it's a miniature version of it, and I'm proud of the work, and so I'm very happy we're shipping this. Next is a bunch of other changes. I did not have a direct hand at any of these. These are, some of this is longer term stuff. Some of this is stuff that we grabbed from the Monday afternoon meeting, first state of the game. And so Blitzcrank essentially is, my understanding of the goals behind this, I was not really part of this work, was the Jungle Blitzcrank update had a lot of collateral damage on Blitzcrank support being, like, feeling supported and feeling fun. Basically, his win rate didn't really move, but the play rate kept dropping. And ultimately, Jungle Blitzcrank pretty much disappeared from play. And so it's like, well, let's just kind of go back on that change list because it hurt him overall in terms of players used to like playing him, and they're playing him less. So we think this update actually kind of hurt him for his core audience. And so it's reverting a lot of the changes. It's giving him back his MR. It's giving him back his HP. It's nerfing back the attack speed. It's flattening the passive back down. So levels 1 through, I think it's like 1 through 5 or something, gets a stronger passive. Mana buffs overall to his W and E. E does more damage, so he's going to have a better trading pattern. R now has a total mana ratio on the passive tick damage. So, I mean, a lot of stuff here. He's going to lose some attack speed, but it's otherwise a lot of buffs. I'm actually expecting Blitz support probably in a very, very strong spot next patch. There's a decent chance we have to nerf him, but overall, I think this will make Blitzcrank a more fun champion, and then, again, we might have to tune him down the line. We'll see, though. Next is a change to Elise. Basically some flat on hit damage, some flat on hit healing increase, and then also the E has a stun rank up. Instead of 0.1 per rank, it's 0.2 seconds per rank to give her a little bit of something to do late game. I mean, ultimately her E doesn't have any damage on it, so it's really hard to have this ability feel good. You're like just trying to have her feel like she has strong teamfight presence late game, but more stunning seems actually reasonable. Lets her get something out of her last few levels, which seems pretty reasonable overall. And not much to say. I think Elise is not terribly strong, so cool. Gnar basically is getting some flat damage on Mega Gnar Q and Mega Gnar W. Not much to say here. He's been 10% pro presence for a long time, for most of summer. He's been low win rate solo queue. We have win rate room on him, and it's like, well, power is a good way to make champions more fun. He is underpowered, so we'll give Gnar some buffs in ways that we hope to not be too elite skewed. Generally speaking, midi Gnar harass tends to be the big elite thing that keeps him in pro jail, and so we're giving him things that aren't midi Gnar harass, and hopefully it lands well on target. Next is Lux. I think this is it seems to be like part of a growing trend where we're really, really willing to give immobile mid lane mages some power. I think they have tended to fall off over time, and that feels pretty bad. And so trying to come back and say, look, these champions I think are pretty low in terms of bullshit. They are immobile, they are squishy, they are gankable, their damage is pretty telegraphed. You can buy Merc Treads, you can buy QSS. There's a lot of things you could do that could probably, there's like a lot of safe counterplay opportunities. These champions are allowed to be tuned on the strong side. I think it's actually very reasonable, personally. I actually totally subscribe to that sort of line of reasoning, right? Because someone's got to be above 50% win rate, someone's below 50% win rate. So why not the immobile mages that have clear counterplay, which is dodge the 1000 range skill shot or burst them, which I think are all totally reasonable. So this is aimed to be power positive to mid and then try to, at best, tread water on support. I think we'd be okay with a small nerf to support as well. There's going to be some variance here, right? We're not going to get exactly right, but essentially it's minus some flat mana regen. Keep in mind the base mana regen stat is purely multiplied by Spell Thieves and its upgrades, whereas Midlux is going to, and certainly Support Lux does too, to be clear, but Midlux buys a Lost Chapter and gets her mana through flat mana and the Lost Chapter regen, and then she finishes Ludens and off you go. But also minus some flat damage on E. The out-of-range E poke. Basically, my suggestion here, I was a little bit a small part of this change, which was at support, Lux is going to throw a max range E and then never follow up, because if she follows for an auto attack on an AD carry or a support, Nautilus throws the hook out and she dies. Lux is not allowed to auto attack Nautilus unless he trolls and stands inside the minion wave. Nautilus shouldn't do this. So the passive buff was already there, but if it's like, hey, if we nerf E damage, buff the passive, support Lux doesn't use this for fear of getting, counterattacked. But mid-lux is meant to be able to fight someone back 1v1. If you're fighting a LeBlanc or a Victor or Neferi or something, it's like, yeah, I E-autoed you. You traded back. I pressed W. Welcome to a trading pattern. So E-auto is up 5 damage. E-no-auto is down 5 damage. This is, I think, pretty good in shifting, around from mid and support. Other thing is Q. So this is a Q buff, rank 2 to 4 on the cooldown. So this is, I think it's 11 flat, becomes 11 to 9, potentially a small cooldown incentive on ranking Q. A lot of support luxes actually go Emax into Qmax just because they want the damage, although shield max second is better, I'm pretty sure. Regardless though, mid lux gets more levels. Support lux is obviously going to leave Q at 1 point wonder, so mid lux gets his buff much sooner than support lux does, and I think the rest of the changes are pretty valuable as well. So trading water 2, probably negative on support. Maybe the Q buff actually matters for support enough. Minus range helps a little bit here. Overall, mid lux should be stronger, support lux should be equal to slightly weaker, and I think those are good changes. Next is Neferi. She's doing too well in a lot of skill brackets in mid and top. There's a big slew of changes here, so a little bit of base health, a little bit of especially early passive cooldown, and now melee champ is going to deal double damage to the dogs. So in top lane especially, for the first, I think it mathed out too. If you don't buy any AD for the first 7 levels, you will auto attack one shot the dogs. And then if you do buy AD, you'll keep doing it for a few more levels. I don't know the breakpoints. I again wasn't really individually involved in these changes, but that's what I picked up from reading changes that people were writing about. But yeah, so a very much top lane focused nerf. Of course, there are plenty of popular mid laners that are melee as well. Right, Zed, Yasuo, Yone, Katarina are 4 of the top 5 most picked mid laners. So there is a lot of melee, but there's even more melee in top lane. Overall, yeah, that's a help there. And then just some damage down on Q, damage down on E. I don't know the economic behind the individual targets, why the individual targets, what exactly the magnitude goals were overall. But what's funny is Neferi's win rate in 13.16 is actually higher than her win rate in 13.15, despite being strictly nerfed with just flat value nerfs, because the mastery curve keeps catching up and giving more and more win to this champion. So yeah, Neferi, of course, still on the strong side. Still, her players are gaining mastery, and this champion just needs to be nerfed until the mastery goal settles down and the win rate actually lands into a good spot. Orianna getting another set of buffs. This is generic health growth going up a small amount, as well as a pretty big bump to W damage, both flat and per rank up. It's plus 10 to 30. This is probably going to be quite a lot of power. I actually really at this point expect we will see Orianna at Worlds. I think that's fine. Again, I think immobile mid lane mages are allowed to be a relatively strong class. I'm glad we're making this buff happen. I think it's a good change. Not much else to say. Tryndamere attack range. You may have seen from the Twitter post that this is plus 50 in our Tuesday evening meeting. What over winter magnitudes? So an analog for this was Master Yi, who got plus 50 attack range and also gained. I mean, there was like other changes in the changes as well. But the analysis that I was provided was that they thought 50 attack range was worth 3% win rate, and our goals were about 1.5% win rate. So this change is actually going to be 25 attack range, and if we're wrong and this ends up being 0.5% win rate, cool, have the other 25 and move on from there. Tryndamere is currently elite skewed. I think it's actually probably reasonable for the champion to be elite skewed, because of the sort of difficulty of playing around the R. Letting him be sub 50 and low elo is reasonable, and then higher elo, like certainly, I mean, really good Tryndameres are good at like using the passive and whatnot, but my sort of expectation here is that higher skilled players are going to be kind of better at accepting and playing around the R, even though again he wins more in higher elos. Just like I think the frustration factor is lower in like Masters compared to like Silver. So I think if Tryndamere remains an elite skewed win rate champion, I think it's actually fine. But anyway, yeah, attack range is going to be less than what you saw on Twitter earlier today. Twist of Fate, simple change, plus AP ratio on the Q, not much to say. I'm just targeting a bit more power on this champion. Again, not much to say here. I don't have a lot to provide. Vex gets some pretty meaningful hits, plus flat Q damage and plus ranks 1 to 4. Well, a buff to rank 1 to 4 of the W cooldown. Pretty big deal here. Worth noting that Vex is sort of positioned to naturally counter quite a bit of the current solo queue mid lane meta. And if you're actively good against champions like Yasuo and Yone, and they're 2 of the 4 most played champions of the game, your win rate should probably be above 50 if you're a balanced champion, because your common matchups are counter matchups in your favor. So if you're like numerically fair, you should win more than half your games. This is the like Malphite has a high win rate because Jace and Jax are popular. I think that was still true for him as well. We did eventually nerf Malphite, but like, Malphite and Vex can sit at 51.5 and be balanced because popular champions are weak into them. They are meta counters. This is a good thing. We probably shouldn't nerf meta counters. Meta counters should be good. They're good into the meta. Anyway, glad we're buffing Vex. Xerath is getting a support-focused nerf. The changes were really good for mid lane. Obviously, he's doing really well. He's getting some pro play. He's an Azir counter. All cool stuff. He is, though, overperforming. He is especially overperforming on support. And so trying to keep mid flat, trying to nerf support, maintain Xerath mid as good. So it's minus flat mana regen, much like with Lux. Spell Thief multiplies this stat, whereas Lost Chapter does not, Mana Flow does not, so this is a heavier support-focused nerf. The amount of cooldown refund on the passive you get per minion you kill, that amp is going, that cooldown refund is going up, so it's more likely to get more passive hits, so that you can compensate for the W mana cost nerf. So essentially, support Xerath just has less mana regen and bigger costs, and mid lane Xerath has that, but doesn't care as much because he's getting a Lost Chapter really early on. And then also, and doesn't have a spell thieves, also is going to get more passives through the cooldown refund. And so I think a solid shape. I think this really makes sense. Moving mana around to make sense for the mid laner and nerf the support because they're definitely doing too well at support right now. Next change here is to Zoe. Health regen up and E-Shred up rank 1 through 4. This is just sort of simple stuff. Zoe's base health regen up a little bit. Pretty simple changes overall. Zoe is pretty elite skewed. She's actually well above 50% win rate in very high MMRs. She's well below 50 elsewhere, unfortunately. So we're trying to make some pretty simple changes that hopefully help less skilled players a bit more. Things like health regen, if she's, just taking some bad trades and doesn't do a good job of kind of maintaining her health pool. Since Zoe's a poke champion, she ostensibly should be able to stay out of harm's way pretty well. And then basically how much shred your E provides while they're asleep. Just a minor damage upgrade, basically, if you land E into Q. But it's only if you land E into Q, right? Like the basic W combo and Q combo and just, basic RQ, those aren't changed. Theory goes that probably E into Q is more of the overall combat throughput of low elo Zoe. I think that's likely to be a bit more true, and so we'll see if that ends up being the case. But overall, yep, small Zoe buffs. Systemically, Duskblade no longer invulnerable during the active. When you go untargetable, you no longer start ignoring ignite damage. Positive change there. And then Static Shiv minus AP ratio. This item launched at 50% AP ratio. It's now at 15% AP ratio. Honestly, it shouldn't have been 50. I shipped the item that way because I said, hey, this should be a cool hybrid item, and it was the cool thing. It was a cool hybrid item. It opened up some hybrid builds, which is really neat. It made it an interesting bridge. But unfortunately, there's two things. So one, this is a sort of direction change that, if we had the idea for this direction earlier on, then this never would have shipped at 50%. But it's, hey, we want to lower the amount of systemic scaling in the game. This is like, hey, your scaling can come from your champion. And so if you get attack damage, you get ability power, you get ability haste, your champion's going to perform more. And as you acquire items, right, 1 + 1 + 1 is 3. So now you've got 3 item patterns coming through. But if those item patterns also scale, well, now it's 1 + 2 + 3, and now it's maybe overpowering your kit. And so we hadn't really, I think, aligned on that as a team, it feels like. But I'm very much in the camp of yeah, I really don't like items effects scaling aggressively. I've said this before, if the total throughput of your champion is, let's call it 75% champion, 25% systems. It's well, in the early game, I have rank 1 Q and electrocute. And then in the mid game, I have rank 5 Q and electrocute and my first item. And at level 18, I've got rank 5 of all my abilities and a rank 3 ultimate and 5 items. It's well, these items can't scale as the rest of everything else, because you've got 5 times as many items, and your Q stops scaling at level 9, right? At least on base value, right? So it's well, these things have to all kind of be balanced together, and I think it's pretty reasonable if items have very, very weak innate growth. I think that's pretty reasonable overall. So yeah, it's taking that lesson. And again, I totally agree with the underlying design philosophy that these effects shouldn't scale nearly as hard, and so they don't. And another big part of this is, of course, LeBlanc is sadly the last remaining static Shiv abuser. I actually really thought that unbinding Shiv to Night Harvester was going to have a big impact. It did not. Shiv, as last I checked, Shiv Harvester is still her best 1-2. Now, to be fair, Shiv Harvester is not far above Shadow Flame X, but there's still something. So it's like, well, okay. Lower the AP ratio, down you go. And that's the patch. Sorry, I paused 10 seconds just to like take a drink of water and then say nothing. But that is the patch preview. Yeah, it's a pretty big patch, right? There are basically 4 or 5 like sort of large systemic changes. I'm again pretty happy with this patch overall. I think it's really cool stuff here. Hope you enjoy it. Going live in a week. See ya.